Okay, so get ready because today we are diving headfirst into the world of human rights.
Oh!
You guys gave us a heck of a challenge with this one.
Yeah.
But I am so ready to dig into this Wikipedia article.
It's a big one.
Oh, it's huge, E.
Yeah.
And uncover some of those, hidden gems about human rights, those surprising historical twists and turns, and those big kind of like thorny debates that we're still like grappling with.
Oh, absolutely. And it's one of those things that I think, we all kind of take for granted, like, human rights, yeah, of course, those are important. But when you really start to kind of unpack it, it gets really fascinating.
It does. It does. But before we get to all that, I think it's important to set the stage. What are we even talking about when we say human rights? Because even that seemingly simple question is more complicated than you might think.
It really is. And you see, Wikipedia defines human rights as moral principles or norms that set standards of human behavior.
Okay.
And they're legally protected.
Okay.
But that word right in human rights, that's where things get kind of sticky, and that's where the philosophical debate really
Interesting. So it's not just a list of rules then?
No, not at all.
Okay.
The very meaning of right is something that philosophers have been kind of going back and forth on for centuries. Is it something inherent?
Okay.
Is it something granted by an authority?
Right.
And if it is a right, does that mean it's absolute? Or can there be exceptions?
Right.
These are huge questions that have huge implications for how we understand, use, apply human rights in the real world.
Totally, totally.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you've got those legal buzzwords.
Yeah.
Inalienable, interdependent, interrelated.
Right.
Tell me, those aren't as dry as they sound.
Well, they do. They sound like they belong in a law textbook, right?
Yeah.
But they actually get at the heart of what makes human rights so powerful and also so challenging.
Okay.
So let's break them down.
Okay, yeah.
Inalienable means that these rights can't be taken away from you.
Okay.
They are inherent to you being human.
So no matter what, you have these rights.
Precisely.
Okay.
That's what inalienable means.
Gotcha.
And then we have interdependent, which means that all these different human rights are connected.
They rely on each other.
Right.
So you can't fully enjoy freedom of speech, for example, if you're living in poverty and don't have access to education or basic necessities.
Yeah, they all kind of play into each other.
They all feed into each other. Exactly.
And what about interrelated? Because that's the other.
Yeah. So interrelated, that kind of speaks to how these rights are interconnected and influence one another.
Okay.
So, for example, think about the right to a fair trial and the right to freedom of expression.
Yeah.
If you can't speak freely and criticize the government, can you truly have a fair trial if you're accused of a crime?
Ooh, good point. Good point.
Right. So these connections get especially interesting when you think about situations where rights might be limited, like during a state of emergency, which is a huge, huge debate. Okay.
We'll be getting to that later on in the episode.
I'm sure. But before we get ahead of ourselves,
yeah,
let's rewind a little bit, do a little history rewind.
Okay.
Because this whole human rights idea isn't exactly like a brand new invention, is it?
You're right. It's not.
Yeah.
And this is where I think one of our first aha moments comes in.
I love it when that happens.
Yeah.
Yes.
Many people trace the concept of human rights back to ancient Greece.
Right.
To thinkers like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle.
The heavy hitters.
Yeah, the OGs, right?
Yeah, totally.
They grappled with these ideas of justice and a natural moral order, what they called dikaion physikon.
So even back then, they were wrestling with these concepts of right and wrong and all that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But was it the same as our modern understanding of individual rights?
That's the thing. It wasn't quite. It was more about this kind of universal sense of justice and how society should be structured to achieve it.
Okay.
Rather than a focus on what we think of as individual entitlements today.
So it's more about the collective, like how do we structure a good society rather than the I as an individual have this right.
Exactly.
Okay, gotcha.
But those early philosophical discussions, they really laid the groundwork for what came later.
Okay, so we've got ancient Greece on the map.
Yep.
Where do we go next on this human rights road trip?
Fast forward a few centuries.
Okay.
And we meet the Stoics.
Okay.
And they built upon those early Greek ideas of natural law, this universal moral code that governs all of humanity.
Gotcha.
But, and this is where it gets really cool, and this is where I think we encounter our first big surprise.
I do love surprises.
Yes.
Lay it on me.
That really challenges that traditional narrative of human rights.
Okay.
We're going to travel all the way back to the 13th century.
Okay.
To the Mali Empire in West Africa.
Whoa, hold on a second.
Yeah.
Human rights in Africa centuries ago.
Exactly.
This is news to me.
This is something that a lot of people don't know.
Right.
You see, long before documents like the Magna Carta or the Declaration of Independence, you have the Kurukan Fuga.
Okay, so tell me about this Kurukan Fuga.
So this charter, created in 1236 after the fall of the Sundiata Keita, is considered one of the first human rights documents in history.
Wow, okay.
And it enshrined rights like the right to life.
Okay.
Protecting people from arbitrary violence and enslavement.
That's huge, yeah.
It even included protections for women.
Right.
Prohibiting their mistreatment, recognizing their social and economic roles.
That's amazing.
It's really remarkable for its time.
Yeah.
And it just goes to show that these ideas weren't limited to one part of the world.
Yeah, it really challenges, like, my whole understanding of human rights history.
It does. It challenges us to really rethink our assumptions about where and when these concepts emerged.
I'm going to need a minute to process.
Heavy big one.
This after the Kurukan Fuga, I think.
Yeah.
So we've gone from ancient Greece to 13th century Mali.
Exactly.
I have a feeling we're about to hit some more familiar territory. Time for the Magna Carta to make its grand entrance.
It's coming.
Okay.
We can't talk about human rights history without talking about the Magna Carta, that 1215 English document.
Yeah.
While not about human rights as we understand them today, it was a key turning point in limiting the power of the monarchy and establishing certain rights for free men.
And that had like a ripple effect, right?
Absolutely. Huge ripple effect.
On other documents and other
huge declarations.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Magna Carta's principles, especially the idea of limiting government authority, echoed through the centuries, influencing revolutions, declarations like the U.S. Declaration of Independence.
Right, which everyone knows. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Exactly. Yeah. You know, that's a really clear example of how these ideas were kind of evolving and taking root in new contexts.
Oh, totally. But let's fast forward a bit.
Okay.
What about the 1800s?
All right.
Is this when the idea of human rights?
This is where things start to heat up.
Okay, tell me more.
Really started to gain traction.
Okay.
You could say that.
Okay.
This is when we see a real shift from those philosophical musings about rights to actual social movements. Demanding rights. Thinkers like Mary Wollstonecraft, who advocated for women's rights, and Frederick Douglass, a powerful voice against slavery.
Yes.
They helped move the conversation from theory into action.
So it's not just what's written down anymore.
Exactly.
It's people standing up and saying, these rights matter and we're going to fight for them.
Exactly. And it's also around this time that the phrase human rights starts to emerge as this unifying concept. You've got the labor movement fighting for workers' rights, the women's suffrage movement demanding the right to vote, anti-colonial movements around the world asserting their right to self-determination. These struggles were all fueled by a growing recognition of the inherent dignity and equality of all human beings.
And it's so interesting to see how those historical struggles,
they're all connected,
are still so relevant today.
Absolutely.
It's amazing.
And as we move into the 20th century, things get even more complex. The stakes get higher. The world is about to face some really unprecedented horrors that, in a way, pave the path for the modern human rights system as we know it.
Wow.
But we'll delve into all of that after a quick break.
Sounds like a plan.
It's almost like, you know, it takes these moments of immense suffering to spark real change, you know?
That's awful.
It is.
But it's true.
And in the case of human rights, the horrors of World War II, especially the Holocaust, really became this major turning point.
Yeah, it's unimaginable, you know.
Unimaginable.
Millions systematically murdered, just awful.
It's difficult to even comprehend the scale of the atrocity.
And for what? Like, it's just...
For simply existing.
Yeah, it's just unfathomable.
And yet it's from that darkness, right, that we see this global determination to make sure that never happens again. Yes. Like the world had seen what happens when hatred and discrimination go unchecked.
Right.
And there was this collective sense that things had to change.
Yeah. So this is where the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR, comes in, right?
This is it, 1948.
Okay.
Representatives from all over the world come together to create this document that would essentially enshrine these basic fundamental rights and freedoms of all people.
That's amazing.
Regardless of race, religion, gender, any other status.
To see that kind of global cooperation.
Right. And so soon after the war, it was really a remarkable moment. It was a huge achievement.
Wow.
And you know, it's interesting because the UDHR itself isn't actually a legally binding treaty, but it's become this foundation for international human rights law.
It's like the gold standard that everyone...
Exactly. It's been translated into over 500 languages.
Wow.
It's the most translated document in history.
That's wild.
Which speaks to its impact.
Totally, yeah.
Its enduring relevance.
Yeah, and yet even with something like human rights that everyone agrees on, there's still these points of contention, right? Like where's the line? What do we focus on?
Where do you draw the line? Yeah. Exactly. And one of the biggest debates that emerged really during the drafting of the UDHR, and that continues to this day, is this question of what kinds of rights are we talking about? What should be prioritized?
Right.
So you have this division between...
Because those are like... big buckets I need, like a little help understanding what's in each one.
Right. So on the one hand, you have civil and political rights. Things like freedom of speech. Freedom of religion, the right to a fair trial, protection from torture. These are often seen as like negative rights. In the sense that they're about protecting individuals from government interference.
So the government can't tell me what to think, can't lock me up without a reason.
Gotcha.
Due process, all of it.
Oh, okay. So what about that other category?
So those are your economic, social, and cultural rights. Things like the right to education, the right to work, adequate standard of living, the right to participate in cultural life.
These are often considered more like positive rights in the sense that they require governments to actually take action to make sure that those rights are being fulfilled.
So it's like one is freedoms from, the other is freedoms to.
You got it.
Okay, gotcha.
And this is where it gets really interesting.
It's bad.
Because this difference really played out in a big way during the Cold War.
So we've got like our ideological battle lines being drawn.
Exactly. You have the capitalist West versus the socialist East. And they had very different ideas about which types of rights should take priority.
I could see that. Yeah, totally.
So capitalist countries tended to emphasize those civil and political rights. You know, they argued that individual freedoms were paramount.
Makes sense, given what they just went through.
Right. They saw those rights as a way to limit the power of the state and to prevent, you know, another totalitarian regime from rising to power.
Yeah. Makes sense.
And then on the other hand, you have the socialist countries. And they argued that economic and social rights were equally, if not more important. They believed that, you know, true freedom couldn't exist without economic security.
Right. Without your basic needs being met.
And social justice.
Having those opportunities. Gotcha. So two very different approaches.
Very different approaches. And this ideological divide ultimately led to the creation of two separate covenants. You have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, and you have the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the ICSCR. So instead of having one unified treaty, you end up with two that reflect these very different...
these different worldviews.
Exactly. And it's interesting because this division... it continues to shape how we think about and address human rights challenges to this day.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, think about, you know, debates around healthcare, education, social welfare programs. These are all essentially debates about economic and social rights.
It's amazing how these historical
debates
are still so relevant.
Absolutely.
It's wild. And I think it's a good reminder that human rights, it's not like we achieved something back in 1948.
Exactly.
And we were done.
It's not static.
It's an ongoing process.
Constant evolution.
It's messy. It's complicated.
It's messy. It's complicated.
That's global.
It is, and it's something that we're constantly grappling with.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so fascinating.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
But before we wrap things up, I want to make sure we take a moment to really, like, connect this back to us.
Yes.
To our lives today.
This is the big question, right?
Because it's one thing to talk about.
What does it all mean?
Yeah, what does it all mean?
Right.
What are we supposed to do with this?
Exactly, because it's one thing to talk about these lofty ideals, but to actually put them into practice.
Right.
In the real world.
Yeah, in this crazy, messy world that we live in.
That's the real challenge, right?
Yeah, it's a lot harder than it sounds.
Much harder.
So where do we even begin with that?
Right, like where do we even begin?
Where do we even begin to unpack all of this?
I mean, I think, like, one of the biggest developments, at least in my lifetime, that has really, like, thrown a wrench in things has been globalization.
Oh, yeah.
You know, the fact that our world is so interconnected through trade, technology, movement of people.
Right.
On the one hand, that's great.
Yeah.
It's led to amazing opportunities for cultural exchange, economic growth, even the spread of human rights awareness.
Yeah, and, like, the world feels smaller now.
It does.
In a good way. Like, we're all kind of in this together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But, you know, on the other hand, globalization has also created these new avenues for exploitation.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Like, now the problems are global.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When we talk about things like human trafficking, forced labor in global supply chains, environmental degradation driven by, you know, unchecked consumption.
Right.
These are all connected to the complexities of this interconnected world.
And it makes it a lot harder to figure out, like,
it does.
Okay, who's responsible?
Who do you hold accountable?
Right.
Because, you know, if you have a company that's, say, based in one country, but they're manufacturing products in another country and selling them all over the world. I mean, who's ultimately responsible for making sure that workers' rights are being respected?
Right.
Whose laws even apply?
It's a good question.
These are huge questions.
Yeah, that I don't think have easy answers.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we can't forget about the elephant in the room. Technology.
It's changing everything so fast.
It's changing everything at an unprecedented pace.
It is.
And it's creating these unprecedented challenges to human rights.
Yeah.
I mean, think about, like, the rise of artificial intelligence.
Oh, yeah.
Facial recognition software.
Right.
The ability to collect and analyze these massive amounts of data about our lives.
Doesn't get it creepy.
It is kind of creepy, right?
A little bit.
It feels very...
like Black Mirror, a little bit.
Black Mirror-esque, you know?
Yeah, a little bit.
But, you know, these technologies have incredible potential for good.
Oh, totally.
I mean, think about healthcare, education, all sorts of things.
Yeah.
But they also raise these really serious concerns.
Of course.
About privacy.
Right.
Freedom of expression.
Right.
And even the potential for discrimination.
Yeah, because if we're letting AI make more and more decisions, how do we make sure that the AI isn't biased?
Right, because AI is only as good as the data it's trained on.
Right, exactly.
If the data itself is biased...
yeah, it's just going to perpetuate those.
You're just going to amplify those biases in ways that can be really, really dangerous.
And how do we even, like, begin to monitor that?
Right. And that's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's something that people are thinking about, you know, academics,
right,
policymakers, technologists are all trying to figure out.
Yeah, it feels like a whole new frontier.
It is a new frontier.
They were just starting to even understand
hugely, and it's really pushing us to rethink our understanding of what human rights even means in a digital age.
Right. Like, is it even possible to have privacy in a digital age?
Right.
You know? Those
exactly. And if not, what are the implications of that?
Yeah, because it feels almost like we need a whole new set of rights for this digital world.
It's like the right to digital privacy, the right to data protection, the right to not be discriminated against by an algorithm.
Right.
These are all things that are being debated right now.
It's a lot.
It's a lot.
And I know we've just scratched the surface here today.
We've barely, you know, dipped our toes in the water.
Dipped our toes in the water, exactly.
Yeah.
But I think, like, if there's one thing I want folks to take away from today's deep dive, it's that, you know, human rights...
it's not a done deal.
Yeah. It's not like, oh, we passed the UDHR. We're good.
We're good. Everyone's got rights now. We can all go home.
Yeah, it's not that simple.
It's not a checklist.
Yeah, it's this ongoing...
it's a process.
It's a journey.
Yeah, it's messy.
It is messy.
Yeah, and we're all kind of figuring it out as we go.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so important. You know, it requires us to constantly question.
To re-examine, to push for progress.
Right, because the world's changing.
The world's changing.
Yeah, and our understanding of what it means to be human is changing.
Exactly. And the challenges to human rights are constantly evolving, so we need to evolve our thinking, our approaches, our strategies.
And on that note, I want to thank you.
Oh, thank you.
For taking this deep dive with us.
It's been a pleasure being here.
Yeah, it's been so fascinating to really unpack this with you.
It's such an important topic.
It is.
And one that I'm really glad that we were able to, kind of shed some light on.
Yeah, and for our listeners, I hope you learned something new today.
Absolutely.
I hope this gave you some things to mull over.
Yeah, some food for thought.
Yeah, some food for thought, exactly.
And hopefully, it might even inspire you to get involved in your own way, because ultimately the future of human rights depends on all of us. It's a collective effort. It is a collective effort. Honestly. Well said. Thank you. Okay, until next time, see you later.